And hello, everyone. My name is Kathleen Woodward. I'm a nationally certified school psychologist and a senior assessment consultant with Pearson. The focus of the webinar today is on utilizing the tools that you already have available to you as part of the digital assessment library for schools, and utilizing those tools in order to improve identification, classification, and differentiation of behavioral and mental health concerns. And I'm going to drop off the screen here and progress through the presentation. Give me 1 sec. Okay. I'll begin by providing a brief overview of the current status of youth mental health in the U.S. based on the most recently published research in this area. And if you're interested in a more comprehensive presentation of this data, I'll be presenting alongside Chris Huzenik, a national education consultant for Pearson, on May 3rd. There's no cost, and NASP and APA CEs will be offered. So please visit the Pearson website to learn more and to register if that's of interest to you. In this presentation, I will then present a comprehensive assessment model as it pertains to emotional, behavioral, and mental health concerns, and discuss how the tools that are included as part of your digital assessment library can be used within that model to better identify student needs. Okay, let's start with a brief update. We all know that the pandemic and everything associated with it had and continues to have a serious impact on mental health, not only for children and adolescents, but for adults as well, including the adults that are supporting our students. It's yet to be seen what the long-term impact will be, but we are all involved in and witnessing the current state of mental health functioning. And more research is now being published that indicates that we are in the midst of a crisis. In the fall of 2021, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, and the Children's Hospital Association declared that the pandemic-related decline in child and adolescent mental health had become a national emergency. Those groups noted at the time that suicide is the second leading cause of death for our youth ages 10 to 24, and that they had been seeing exceptionally high rates of loneliness, anxiety, depression, trauma, and suicidality in youth. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, emergency department visits for suspected suicide attempts among adolescents jumped 31% in 2020 compared with 2019. In February and March of 2021, emergency department visits for suspected suicide attempts were 51% higher among girls aged 12 to 17 than during the same period in 2019. Mental health challenges are the leading cause of disability and poor life outcomes in young people. And in recent years, we have seen substantial increases in certain mental health disorders in our youth, including depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. So in December 2021, the US Surgeon General issued an advisory on protecting youth mental health, calling it an urgent public health crisis that will require, quote, an all hands on deck effort to address. The advisory includes a call to action by educators, school staff, and school districts, including, as quoted, recognizing signs of changes in mental health and behavior and taking appropriate action to address the needs of students. School professionals, we know, are on the front line of addressing the current mental health crisis among children and adolescents. I'd like to emphasize a few statistics based on CDC data related to children aged 3 to 17. So 7.4%, or approximately 4.5 million, have a diagnosed behavior problem. 7.1%, or approximately 4.4 million, have diagnosed anxiety. And 3.2%, or approximately 1.9 million children, have diagnosed depression. So some of these conditions commonly occur together as well. So for example, having another disorder is most common in children that have depression. About 75% of those children also have anxiety, and almost 50% have behavior problems. And for children with anxiety, 38% also have behavior problems, and 33% also have depression. So we know comorbidity is very high, not only with other emotional and behavioral concerns, but also learning disabilities and other diagnoses. Student mental health concerns are not new. However, they are increasingly more prevalent. In March 2022, the US Department of Health and Human Services published a study in the American Medical Association's journal, JAMA Pediatrics, that reported substantial increases in diagnoses of anxiety and depression in children and adolescents between 2016 and 2020. Diagnoses of anxiety grew 29%, and diagnoses of depression grew 27% during that time period, with the most significant growth occurring between 2019 and 2020. The study also indicated a 21% increase in the number of children exhibiting behavioral or conduct issues between 2019 and 2020. So before the pandemic, mental health was getting worse among all students, including our high school students, according to that prior CDC data. More recent data indicates growing concerns. A recent survey of high school students throughout the country indicates 44% reported they persistently felt sad or hopeless during the last year. So let me reiterate that. 44% of high school students reported they persistently felt sad or hopeless during the past year. You can see, in addition to that data, alarming rates of both physical and emotional abuse being reported. And this relates back to the issue around the decline in mental health in adults during the pandemic and following, as well as in children and adolescents as a result of the pandemic. And this type of information highlights the critical role that history and context play as part of a comprehensive evaluation. As we're considering how we have traditionally addressed, or in some cases maybe not addressed, mental health concerns, particularly anxiety, depression, and suicidality, through assessment for special education or other services, we have to now grasp the sheer magnitude of the number of students experiencing mental health issues and reconceptualize assessment practices so that we can better identify struggling students and provide the needed supports, potentially on a much larger scale. You can find a substantial amount of information and resources pertaining to mental health in the Pearson Mental Health Resource Center on our website at pearsonassessments.com. I do highly recommend taking a look at the 2023 industry report on K-12 mental health. You'll find very interesting data reported there, as well as links to the most recent research and statistics on youth mental health in the US. Okay, so let's move over to assessment and identification. As mentioned, mental health issues need to be better identified in school settings so struggling students can get needed services and supports. Timely and accurate identification requires application of what we are considering two best practices to move from the tradition of relying on clinical assessments that have static psychometric properties to the application of a more fluid approach to identification and intervention. So the first step is a process that expands the use of differential assessment processes, methods, and measures by the inclusion of an expanded repertoire of tools and the inclusion of new types of information. The second aspect of that is a more seamless process connecting assessment results with interventions and services to better guide those efforts, as well as provide a baseline for progress monitoring. A comprehensive model of assessment for emotional, behavioral, and mental health concerns includes universal screening to identify students who may be struggling, followed by increasing levels of assessment, which would include gathering information through interviews and observations, utilizing parent, caregiver, teacher, and student self-report rating forms, starting with broadband assessment and then employing narrowband assessment to further differentiate and prioritize the needs of individual students. And then from there, selecting and applying interventions based on the assessment data and monitoring those interventions, truly and effectively monitoring the effectiveness of the interventions so that they can be adapted if needed in order to ensure the student is getting what they need. There are, of course, differences from district to district and state to state throughout the US, but what we see most often in working with districts throughout the country of all sizes is that districts historically are not effectively screening students for mental health concerns, and that progress monitoring efforts are very inconsistent. So within your digital assessment library, you already have access to the tools. So the barrier of funding is removed in that case. And really it's just a matter of how do you employ the tools that you have access to. So let's start with the BAS3. Most of you are likely familiar with the teacher, parent, and self-report rating forms, and we'll get into a little more detail about those shortly. But did you know that you also have access to the other components of BAS3, which is a whole comprehensive system of assessment? The BESS, the BAS3 BESS, is used to efficiently screen students at risk for developing behavioral and emotional problems, and can also be used for progress monitoring, in addition to the BAS3 Flex Monitor, which is designed specifically as a progress monitoring tool. So let's take a quick look at those. This is the stage gate model and how the BESS can be incorporated into a larger framework for evaluating and managing behavioral and emotional issues, especially considering the state that we are currently in. Students identified as at risk on the BESS require additional assessment or services, and then they're moved to the next stage. And the amount of resources and time spent, of course, increases with each stage in this process. This is a standardized and systematic approach to assessment and evaluation. It helps educators, mental health professionals determine which students, of course, are at risk, first of all, to start, which ones are most at risk, and those who are in need of services. And it can also, this process can also help in terms of determining the necessary allocation of staff and resources to address concerns in each individual district. The BAS3 BESS consists of 3 brief forms. They range from 25 to 30 items. They can be completed by teachers, parents, or students. There is a behavioral and emotional risk index score that looks at overall risk by way of T-scores and percentile ranks. And then there are sub-index scores for externalizing risk, internalizing risk, and adaptive skill risk for the teacher and parent forms. For the student forms, the sub-indexes are internalizing risk, self-regulation risk, and personal adjustment risk. It's so critical to be screening students across these areas, maybe most importantly for internalizing risk, because there may be no outward or disruptive behavior to alert others to the internal struggles that a particular student may be experiencing in their symptomatology related to anxiety and depression in particular. When the BESS is administered within Q Global, there are multiple validity indicators. The F index indicates the severity of the rating, consistency indicates if questions are answered in a consistent manner, and then the response pattern index, which is true for all of our behavior rating forms in Q Global, indicates if questions are answered in a patterned way, since we actually can't see the form and can't determine if people are barber pulling their way through the questions, for example. Then each of the scores are provided as part of the report. I want to note here that for large scale screening efforts, For school-wide, district-wide, or statewide screening, we do recommend using the BEST on the Review 360 platform because the reporting features are designed to provide aggregate as well as deaggregated data based on multiple variables, whereas Q Global is designed for individual or small group assessment. So you do have access to that as part of the digital assessment library within Q Global. Back to the stage gate model, progressing to stage 2, comprehensive assessment involves further assessment of students who were identified as at risk at stage 1. So we would then administer the BASC-3, a comprehensive rating scale and broadband measure. So let's take a look at how advanced interpretation of the BASC-3 rating scales can lead to better identification and differentiation. So let's take a look right now at how we use the BASC-3 to assess for emotional disturbance. And while we're doing that, prior to doing that, I want to take a look quickly at how emotional disturbance is defined in IDEA, so the federal definition that's provided to us, and what some of the kind of issues or concerns, long-standing issues and concerns related to identification and differentiation, what they are within the definition. So the term emotional disturbance means a condition exhibiting one or more of the following characteristics over a long period of time, which traditionally we have considered a long period of time to be 6 months or more, and to a marked degree. At that point, we would assume that they mean statistically significantly different than a normative population, that adversely affects a child's educational performance. And that's been up for debate in many states around what does that specifically mean. That if a student is getting straight A's, for example, is their emotional condition adversely affecting their educational performance? In some states, yes, it does mean that, and in other states, not necessarily. So there are some differences there in terms of how the laws interpreted. So you can see the various categories: inability to learn that can't be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors, so exclusionary criteria; inability to build or maintain interpersonal relationships with peers or teachers; inappropriate types of behaviors or feelings under normal circumstances; a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, and a tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears. So depression, anxiety are included in there, as well as abnormal behavioral concerns. And then lastly, the term does include schizophrenia. The term does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted, unless it's determined that they have an emotional disturbance. So that probably is the most kind of talked about or controversial part of the definition, because it essentially indicates that a student can be both socially maladjusted and emotionally disturbed. And it does create some issues when we're looking at differentiation and identification. So we do have improved means of making those determinations and figuring out what are the best interventions for a student that may have both social maladjustment and emotional disturbance. Given how widely the BASC-3 rating forms are used, I'm operating under the assumption that that you all have a solid understanding of all the scales, particularly the clinical and adaptive scales. So I'm not going to spend time on that. Instead, I'm going to focus, or I'm just going to highlight the content scales and the indexes and focus some time on the new emotional disturbance qualification scales, or EDQs, all of which allow for increased differentiation. Let's start with the content scales. So how can they help us differentiate and thereby lead to more individualized interventions? And as we review these scores, consider them in the context we have just discussed, and also relative to your own experience assessing students. The content scales are theoretically derived scales that contain some unique items that are written specifically for the scale, in addition to items shared from other clinical and adaptive scales. For example, if we look at emotional self-control, it is influenced by negative emotions like sadness, frustration, stress, or fear. It's a subset of self-regulation or executive functioning. It tends to be elevated in students identified as having emotional disturbance, and it's generally associated with more pervasive executive functioning problems. You'll find interpretive data related to each of those content skills that is going to help you differentiate based on the student's overall profile. So don't overlook those in the report as you're going through your interpretation when you're assessing kids in this area. The index skills are empirically derived skills that include items that best differentiate between children with and without clinical disorders or educational classifications. They can be particularly useful for establishing the overall level of impairment, such as the case of the functional impairment index. And they can also be used to inform decision-making when the results from the clinical and adaptive skills are not as clear-cut as we'd like them to be. And I want to point out here the EBD probability index, for example, that provides an indication of the similarity between the obtained behavioral disturbance or disability. Children who present with elevated scores likely exhibit a variety of behaviors that are disruptive, they're unusual or antisocial, they result in strained relationships with adults and peers, and they may also display a range of negative emotions like anger, pessimism, and sadness. So let's take a look now at the new scale, the EDQs, the emotional disturbance qualification scales, which are relatively new. They were added to the BAS3 report about 2 years ago. We do continue to get a lot of questions about these particular scales, so it's worth spending some time on. Get that up on the screen here. So how do we differentiate between the emotional and behavioral disorder index that we just talked about, the EBD index, and the EDQ? So they were created using radically different methods, and they're complementary to one another. They provide very different types of information though. Because of the differences in the derivation of the EBD index and the EDQs, they will not always agree, although they typically do. So just don't be completely surprised if you see some differences between the scores. As we discussed, the EBD index is actuarially derived with no regard for item content. It's based on the ability of items to differentiate purely statistically students in special education with pre-existing classifications of ED and non-referred students. So we perceive that there's a national referral bias that favors teachers or that favors teacher referrals of students who tend to be more aggressive and display more externalizing problems, as we know. And so that index, EBD index, subsequently correlates more highly with externalizing disorders, and it's less sensitive to students with internalizing disorders because of the way the sample plays out. So in contrast, so the 5 composites of the EDQs are solely content-derived scales based on expert opinion and consensus in order to match the content of the BAS3 scales to the criteria of the federal definition. And you can see here how they are aligned. Each of the EDQ composites is based on items aligned with the constructs of ED as represented in IDEA. So a couple of things to kind of keep in mind around the EDQs. The EDQs are new combinations of BAS3 scales. They're grouped to align with the constructs of ED as they're represented in IDEA. it's not a diagnosis because it's based on the criteria. It's not a specific DSM alignment. So there's some differences there. They are useful when you're conducting a comprehensive evaluation specifically for special education eligibility. And they are expert scales designed to match that criteria that's put forth in the definition. But they don't answer the question of why do students behave as they do. So some students who meet the criteria for ED based on behavior might be better categorized under a different disability when their behaviors are better accounted for by the other disabilities. So that's one thing to be aware of. And another thing is that nearly all students with ADHD, for example, will have inappropriate behavior under normal circumstances. And sometimes that could be caused by an emotional disturbance. However, in most cases, those behaviors are better accounted for by the presence of ADHD. A similar concept applies to students that have autism spectrum disorder. So just a word of caution, something to be aware of when you're really differentially diagnosing students or classifying students in an education setting. This is an example of the computer score report that's produced within your current BAS3 report. And so if you're not seeing it in there, I'll show you in just a minute where you can change the setting in your Q Global account to make sure that that is reflected in there. So you can see that when you are running the report, you're going to see scores in each of the individual areas, and then you're also going to see a social maladjustment indicator, either present or not present. And that essentially identifies cases that might warrant further investigation. As we know, the term social maladjustment has not been operationally defined by IDA, so use it for your purposes to help guide and develop your hypotheses about a student, and just being aware that this information could ultimately be interpreted differently if you have conflicting other information as part of your evaluation. So just be aware of the utility of the scores, but they are very helpful, and like I said, based on the criteria as it's written. This is the narrative that's included in the report. It goes through and describes each individual area as well as the social maladjustment indicator. And if you're not seeing that as part of your current BAS3 rating form reports, just make sure when you are preparing to generate the report that you have that area selected under advanced clinical interpretation. And you will then start seeing it show up. There's nothing more that you need to enter or add. The information will be automatically included in your report. Also, if you want to learn more about the development and interpretation of the EDQs, there is a supplement located in your resource library in the BAS3 folder. So if you're in Q Global, you go to resource library, go down to BAS3, you'll see it under the teacher, parent, student rating forms, and you'll see an area where it says emotional disturbance qualification scales, supplemental information. It will provide much more detailed information. Okay, so we're going to progress through to narrowband assessment, which helps us to go deeper and to gain further diagnostic clarity, differentiation, and additional information to guide and prioritize interventions. Within the digital assessment library, you have access to the Beck Youth Inventories. Each of these inventories can be used separately. They take 5 to 10 minutes or so, or you can combine them. So anywhere between 30 and 60 minutes in terms of the full form, and it can be administered either individually or in groups. Of course, there's remote on-screen administration options in Q Global as well. Each of them contains 20 statements about thoughts, feelings, or behaviors associated with emotional and social impairment. And then the responses are in a Likert scale item response format. So as you're kind of considering the progression of your own evaluations, so let's say you do start with a screener and the student is identified at risk, and then you move forward with BASC rating forms, a broadband assessment, which also has clinical elevations in specific areas. At that point, you might want to go deeper in order to differentiate what specifically is the concern for this student and where do we want to start and prioritize our interventions, which is where this tool will come in particularly handy. So given the high comorbidity rates we discussed earlier between anxiety, depression, and disruptive behavior, the individual scales included in the Beck Youth inventories can give us that additional information pertaining to each set of symptoms. So there's a depression inventory, anxiety, an anger inventory, disruptive behavior inventory, and a self-concept inventory. So once again, you already have access to those in your digital assessment library. Please check out the resource area if you want to take a look at the manual for that, if you want some additional information there. And I do want to also focus a little bit on ADHD and executive functions as part of our emotional and behavioral evaluation, and go into some of the tools that are included there. So we'll start with a couple of facts. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but these stats from the CDC reflect the most recent studies around prevalence rates in the US. The data was gathered from 2016 to 2019, and estimates prevalence rates of about 9.8% for all children aged 3 to 17. So almost 10% of students have a diagnosis of ADHD. So let's talk about where we are now. School closures during the pandemic exacerbated the symptoms of ADHD for students who were already diagnosed. And then secondly, what we saw was an increase in referrals for evaluation for ADHD as symptoms in those that were not yet diagnosed became not only more pronounced, but they were more readily observed by parents, caregivers, and the students themselves. So practitioners, both in and outside of schools, were having and continue to have concerns about being able to differentially diagnose ADHD from other disorders, given the state that we are currently in, and also to discern whether symptoms are being exhibited across environments and how they can be addressed in a school setting. So we want to be able to address all of the concerns in order to optimize the students' academic experience and their outcomes, but we also need to take a look at how differential diagnosis plays a part in our own evaluations in the school setting. So there's no single test or questionnaire or source of information that's sufficient for an accurate diagnosis for ADHD. Current best practice in evaluating students for ADHD requires the use of multiple assessment methods and sources of information, including diagnostic interviews with parents and teachers, behavior rating skills that are completed by parents and teachers and students, and direct observations of behavior either in school or clinical settings. So in addition to a review of the available school records and other information that can be attained. So back to the BASC, we can talk a little bit here about the clinical skill descriptions for assessing students for ADHD. And of course, we have the attention problems and hyperactivity clinical scales. And so the teacher and parent forms can ID specific areas related to ADHD, attention problems like distractibility, poor concentration, being overactive, rushing through work without thinking, and then also help us identify possible comorbidity with other disorders that we may be addressing. So the ADHD probability index demonstrates children who present with elevated scores on this particular index. They likely experience problems that will adversely affect their academic performance. like difficulty focusing or maintaining attention, inability to organize their tasks effectively, difficulty making decisions, and whatnot. And the Bassery also includes an executive functioning content scale, which is comprised of items from all of the executive functioning indexes, which I'll show you on the next slide. And if a student has high scores on the executive functioning content scale, and it indicates that there could be pervasive problems with self-regulation. They may have ADHD-like symptoms. They're often already diagnosed with ADHD. Students with TBI also are likely to score high on this, and other disorders that have an impact on executive functions may also score high on there. The executive function content scale is broken down further into problem solving, attentional control, behavioral control, and emotional control, along with a narrative that describes the associated behaviors. So you can see that as part of your report once again. So once we have identified or we have a hypothesis that a student is struggling with ADHD-like symptoms and or other disorders that could impair executive functions, we definitely want to take a look at executive functions themselves in more detail. In the digital assessment library, you have access to the Brown executive function and attention scales. And these scales measure symptoms of ADHD directly and quantifiably. There are profile configurations that you can derive from the test results that can be used to then suggest possible diagnoses or other hypotheses, excuse me. The items on the Brown are more specific and contextual. They take into account situational variability, and the items also focus on severity of specific problems rather than frequency, like we see on many of our other scales. And this allows the examinees to report more accurately how much difficulty they are experiencing with each specific symptom. So, there's a continuum, of course, in terms of executive functions, and some kiddos have developed compensatory skills, and so they may not be as impaired in their executive functions in a particular area, and so it gives them the chance to identify what problem areas they are actually experiencing and to what extent. The Brown is, the scales are designed to measure kind of the broader notion of attention as a broader group of interacting executive functions, and it's the model is laid out as such, as you can see on the slide here. So organizing or activation, focus, effort, emotion, memory, and action. Similar constructs to other models of executive function that we see in the literature as well. We are very excited to announce that the Connors 4 is now available on Q Global and is also available to Digital Assessment Library customers as an optional add-on. And so be sure to take a look at that. It's a very nominal cost to add it in there and adds a lot of value to the type of assessment that you can do for students, specifically those students that you are taking a look at for ADHD. So the Connors 4th edition is a comprehensive assessment of symptoms and impairments associated with ADHD and other common co-occurring problems and disorders in children aged 6 to 18. And then lastly, in terms of the behavior rating forms for ADHD, the DREF is another measure of executive functions that's also included in your DAL subscription. There are 3 core indexes and a total composite score for behavioral, emotional, and cognitive functioning. And then there's 4 second level index scores identifying patterns of clinically relevant symptoms. So one use that we have seen with many of our digital assessment library districts is that they will utilize the DREF as a supplement to the Brown specifically at the secondary level for teacher ratings. So you can consider that as an option. And of course, the DRAF can be used as a standalone measure of executive functions as well. So just consider that as potential as you're looking at ADHD and related disorders. And we also offer performance-based measures for executive function as part of the digital assessment library. So you have access to select subtests right now from the DCAFs and the NEPC2 that are available on Q Interactive. But keep an eye out for the new fully digital DCAFs 2 that's coming soon. If you were at NASP and you had an opportunity to stop by the booth and see a demo of that, you understand how exciting it is and how innovative the tasks are. So keep an eye out for that. That will, of course, also likely be included in your digital assessment library going forward. Okay, we just have a few minutes left, so I'm going to get into quickly what progress monitoring looks like as part of the digital assessment library. We want to make sure that we're monitoring intervention effects quantitatively, that using instruments that have known psychometric properties versus anecdotal data, so that we can really get a good understanding of whether or not we need to make changes to the current interventions. We want to avoid any kind of subjective approaches or informal checklists, as they don't tend to hold up in terms of their validity related to progress monitoring. So the Flex Monitor is included in the digital assessment library. It can be used to monitor behavioral and emotional functioning over a select period of time. You can choose a monitoring form, or you can develop your own form using an item bank, and I'll take you through that in just a moment. You'll choose the rater, either a teacher, parent, or student. It can be administered digitally, and you can set up recurring administrations and also generate reports that will evaluate change over time. So I'm going to show you here some of the predetermined forms you can choose. They're all age appropriate and adjusted for age. We have some forms specifically related to ADHD monitoring, internalizing problems, disruptive behaviors, and developmental social disorders. For self-report, we have an internalizing problems and a school problems form already available. But like I said, you can also develop custom forms where you, as a practitioner, you're able to choose from the item pool and build your own form. So that as you're searching for items, you can filter based on certain criteria, and it will pull up all of the items related to that criteria within our item bank. And then you can just select which items apply most appropriately to your student. And then the adjustments can be made throughout the building of the form and resaved multiple times. So you can also share them with other users. So if you want a consistent form, if there's a program, for example, that you're testing out for a group of students and multiple raters will be in there for progress monitoring, you can share that form out. The reports have T-scores that are generated based on the standardization samples for the teacher, parent, and self-report forms of the BAS3. And this allows for comparisons with a normative population, and it helps us to describe how extreme the scores are, and take a look at it over time as well. You can see that there's a graphing option that allows for multiple intervention points and taking multiple assessment points based on how long your intervention is. So you can actually provide this graphical data with standardized information related to that student's progress. So make sure to check it out within the digital assessment library. We are right at the end of time. Please feel free to ask additional questions. If you didn't get your questions answered, as Sherry said, please stay on and submit those questions to us, and we'll make sure and get back with you. Thanks for attending.